Hi, my name is Marikka Williams, and today I will share with you what is SUP with Avenza. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I wanted to spend some time in the great outdoors, so I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to test Avenza Maps with my Algonquin Group of 7 Portland Map series that I presented at the CCA conference in 2022. Inspired by the theme, I chose to head to Algonquin Provincial Park to SUP Canoe Lake, a favored location rendered in many of the Group of 7 paintings. Avenza Maps mobile app was easy to use, and it helped me navigate through the shifting winds while pacing myself to return safely to the dock by sunset. It also enabled me to document my experience so that I could later follow up and create a memory map with Avenza MAPublisher. I hope this presentation helps you navigate with Avenza through any outdoor activity you seek to experience. In this presentation, I share the organic workflow that I go through when creating a cartographic product to support a specific activity. It involves research, determining the most appropriate scale, acquiring the data that I need to support that activity, investing time to get to know the data, customizing my palette and symbol set to intuitively communicate, labeling the knowns, identifying and demystifying the unknowns, integrating appropriate measures and analysis that support the activity, and making it accessible so that it can be utilized to support future decisions related to that activity. In this scenario, it was a stand-up paddleboard lake excursion. I had my Avenza mobile app with my Algonquin Portland Map series loaded up, as well as access to the OSM base map. The data acquisition phase not only requires an understanding of the activity, but of the data sources that are available to support that activity. Data selection choices are not only impacted by the scale of the activity, but by the information needs related to that activity. Further to that, there are data quality concerns that need to be addressed, so these various facets require multiple strategies to navigate through. OpenStreetMap is an easily accessible open-source data resource that provides a means to get to know data and download data packages. It is important to note that this data is crowdsourced, and so cross-checks are necessary, and caution should be exercised when utilizing this data. Tracetrack Topo is a themed resource that provides context for an outdoor activity, and the web interface provides an opportunity to get to know the data before importing it into Adobe Illustrator with Avenza MAPublisher. It also provides you with an opportunity to export that data. Another means of acquiring data is through the geospatial data extraction tool maintained by Natural Resources Canada. You can search for a location and define your own study area, or you can use predefined clipping areas. I selected the NTS map sheets, which worked well for my purposes. It is easy to download and provides data compiled at a 1 to 50,000 scale, which is a good starting point for creating a base map for an activity of this nature. Ontario GeoHub is another excellent resource for creating maps to support outdoor activities in Ontario. I acquired the bathymetry data from this resource. USGS Earth Explorer is another means of acquiring data to create new data or cross-reference existing data to prepare for fieldwork. This data is freely available. I was able to download a virtually cloudless image captured by Landsat satellites just 6 weeks before my visit. Once the data is acquired, it is necessary to set up the workspace. During this phase, the workspace is configured so that it is aligned with the activity in relation to scale, projection, and study area extent. This is an excellent resource to determine an appropriate local projection. Next, determining whether or not the projection is available in Avenza MAPublisher is important. Then specifying the format and importing the data. Selecting the feature classes that support the activity. Setting up the map view. Including setting the destination coordinate system first and then specifying the scale. I designed for a 1 to 5,000 scale because it made sense in relation to the resolution of the information that I wanted to make available to support the activity. The data that I gathered extended beyond my artboard, so I expanded it until I could determine the proper extent. I imported the OSM package that I extracted from the web tool, aligning it with the 1 to 5,000 scale map view that I initially set up, and then adjusted the artboard to focus in on my study area and draw a rectangle in a new layer to the extent of the artboard. I used that rectangle to crop all of the data to the artboard extent. Following that, any additional data that I import, I align with the existing 1 to 5,000 scale map view. and crop by activating a spatial filter that is set to crop to the extent of the artboard. I generated a 0.5 square kilometer grid using ArcGIS Pro and imported it into my workspace in order to provide a reference to perform measures and further refine my study area. I cropped the data to the extent of the grid. Then I used the map point plotter to create centroids for the 0.5 square kilometer grids. Following that, I created a scale that integrated with a color palette that I prefer. Selected the appropriate measurement unit and number of intervals for my scale so that I could easily perform calculations with reference to the scale bar. I also created a grid with 0.005 degree latitude and longitude intervals, with degrees, minutes, and seconds labeled and oriented to the grid to facilitate orienteering. Once I had my bearings, I paddled on. The next point of interest that I encountered was a birdhouse. I felt that this was an opportune time to customize my color palette and symbol set. So I imported swatches and symbols from the MAPublisher library and customized them to support the activity. The swatches are customized to reflect the natural colors of the landscape, and the symbols that I selected and customized integrate with the theme. By the time I reached the first island, I was ready to start symbolizing the data. MAPublisher theme sheets is the best way to manage the process of symbolizing data. It involves creating a new theme, selecting the geometry type, linking to the source feature, setting up rules, which are basically attribute queries, which can be achieved using one rule for all of the features in the dataset, or performing a batch process based on an attribute to set the fill, stroke, weight, and opacity. I set up one theme sheet with one rule for one feature to define water area features with a fill but no stroke. I set up another theme sheet with one rule for more than one feature to define multiple features with the same geometry with the same symbology, noting it is important to define the fill as no color and 0% opacity to avoid the wedge shapes appearing in linear features. I applied a fill and a stroke to differentiate the land from water, and utilized batch rules to set up symbology based on a category such as road class in this instance. In some cases, the visual properties need to be modified to render road features progressively by applying larger weights for the primary roads and smaller weights for the service roads, tracks, and trails. I converted the trails to a dash line manually by selecting those features and modifying the dash weight cap and cap pattern. Now I have a sense of scale. The land is differentiated from the water. I know where the roads and the trails are, and I feel like I have a good foundation to paddle on. But before I go too far, I want to shed light on other aspects of the geography. Adobe Photoshop and Geographic Imager provide a means to harvest and enhance Landsat imagery, which is useful for getting to know the terrain, creating new data, and ground truthing the accuracy of the spatial component of the existing data. With this technology, it is possible to combine Landsat satellite bands by merging channels. It is also possible to crop satellite imagery to a vector file extent to focus in on the study area, and then adjust the curves to reveal the natural colors of the landscape. Further to that, it's possible to heal the clouds with the spot healing brush tool. You can then export it to a GeoTIFF and import the image into Adobe Illustrator with Avenza MAPublisher multiple data import so that it stays in alignment with the map view. Then it's possible to apply a clipping mask so that you can focus in on the immediate study area and proceed with cross-checking the spatial data extent of the water features and accuracy of the road and trail features, and even create new data if you wish. Once I reached the Grand Island, I knew it was time to dive a little deeper into the spatial data before venturing into the wind. ArcGIS Pro provides access to terrain visualization techniques that I incorporate into my maps when it makes sense. Since I had bathymetry data from LEO, I interpreted a DEM using this data as the input. I then utilized it as the input to generate the filled contours with the Terrain Tools Python script to represent the bathymetry with vector data. I also utilized a Terrain Tools Python script to create illuminated contours with the interpolated bathymetry for the illuminated contours in the water, and with the Esri Living Atlas topography data to generate the illuminated contours on the land. The 1.5 kilometer paddle between Grand Island and the sandbar was very rough due to the strong winds. The mobile app screenshot on the right provides a view in the context of the 0.5 square kilometer grid that I integrated into my memory map. The water was incredibly choppy, and there was no turning back, so I was completely focused on staying afloat. Looking back, I can see that I was also challenged by the turbulence that the wind stirred up in the deeper water. I didn't discover this until I reached the sandbar when I symbolized the illuminated land and bathymetry contours. The illuminated contours I created to accentuate the bathymetry are rendered in relation to light and shadow, with the light originating in the northwest and the shadows rendered in the southeast. I wanted to render the filled contours in 1 meter increments, which is why I customized the blue color ramp at the birdhouse. This made it easy to batch generate rules, set the fill ramp, and apply opacity settings globally. The codes that you see here represent the direction that the slope faces, so it is easy to apply the same strategy for both the illuminated contours on land and in the water. The primary difference between the two are the number of directions that are represented, as there is more variability on the land, so there are slight variations between the two. The illuminated bathymetry contours are overlain on a semi-transparent water area layer, with the filled bathymetry contours placed below both the bathymetry illuminated contours and the semi-transparent water feature layer. The illuminated contours on the land are simply overlain on the light yellow background. As I paddled toward the inlet, I started to become aware of more houses on this side of the lake. The mobile app screenshot on the right provides a view of the distribution of the buildings that I symbolized in my memory map. I created a custom symbol for the buildings that matched my color scheme, but I had to experiment with the scale until it was balanced with the other features. And the overall balance tends to shift as you add more features and labels, so this is something that I typically have to revisit. I paddled on until I reached a shallow area that was filled with a lot of jagged stumps. I felt that it was worthy of note, as they are a hazard to watercraft and particularly to air-filled SUP boards. It occurred to me that at that point it would be helpful to label the bathymetry. The mobile app screenshot on the right provides a view of the bathymetry labels that I integrated into my memory map. The labeling process is fairly simple. It involves connecting to the feature that you wish to label, indicating if it is labeled or an obstacle or both, applying a filter if applicable, specifying the label field, the style, and the placement rules. And after that, there is a fair amount of manual labor involved in adjusting the labels so that they are easy to read in context, which is an iterative process as more labels are added. At the stumps, I focused on labeling the bathymetry contours, selecting the style, selecting the placement rules, leaving the grouping rules as is, and enabling the labels to repeat. In the conflict avoidance settings, I unchecked the option to allow it to cross obstacles in an attempt to resolve overlaps. I still needed to make quite a few amendments, but you can see how having the values available make it easier to interpret the depth of the water. As I paddled along, I saw a sign, and it drew me in, so I pulled up on shore for a brief visit with the memory of Tom Thompson, the renowned artist who painted in Algonquin Park from 1912 to 1917. It made sense to label the roads and contours while I was on the land. The mobile app screenshot on the right provides a view of some of the contour labels that I integrated into my memory map to reveal the hilly character of the landscape. I set the size of the font to 12 point to make the labels accessible and applied a halo the same color as the land to make the labels easier to read. I decided to apply a label filter for the roads so that I could symbolize Highway 60 with a shield. I set the style to 12 point and selected an Ontario Provincial Highway shield. The roads on this side of the lake are mostly unnamed, so I selected Arrowhand Road, the only named road, and activated the Label Tagger tool to label it, specifying the name field, the target label layer, and normal style. Then I bolded it in a 14-point font so it would stand out. At the confluence of the Oxtongue River and Potter Creek, it seemed obvious that it was time to label the water features. I specified the waterway labels to follow similar rules to other linear features. setting the font to 14 point with a halo. For the water area features, I paid attention to visual hierarchy, but because there were so few, I performed this process manually rather than creating a filter. I started with a 16-point font for the larger water features. I enabled stacking and automated font reduction. Then I did not set the rule to enable the labels to cross obstacles so that it would prompt the automated font reduction, and if that did not occur, I manually made adjustments for the smaller water features. I specified the placement settings with a preference for a horizontal angle. I then made manual adjustments as needed to create a sense of balance in relation to the other symbols and labels. By this time, I was starting to become a bit conscious of the time. From the paddleboard, it seemed like the home stretch was just around the bend, but Avenza Maps indicated I had a ways to go. So I decided that I should probably label the points of interest. I set the font at 14-point semi-bold with a halo. Since I chose not to use icons for points of interest, I place the label priority at the center of the point, and once the labels are created, I turn off the spatial data layer. I allow for stacking and font reduction. I also allow it to cross obstacles since there were so few in the data that I have. After labeling the points of interest, I felt a greater sense of connection to the cultural history of Canoe Lake. Fortunately, the weather and the water was fairly calm by this time, but as I paddled along, I thought it might be a good idea to calculate measures to the shore with azimuth lines, which you can partially see in the screenshot of the Avenza mobile app that provides a view of my memory map on the right. I started by drawing the primary azimuth lines manually and then performed manual calculations using a calculator and my scale bar text where 1 centimeter equals 50 meters. This helped provide some perspective and gave me the strength to paddle on. Eventually, I saw the lighthouse in the distance. It was truly a beacon of hope, and I knew it would not be very long until I reached the dock, but I thought that it might be helpful to create some half-kilometer buffers to get a sense of how much further it was. I created buffers at 0.5 kilometer intervals from the center of the northern part of Canoe Lake. With this information, I could measure the distance intuitively to determine that I had about 2 kilometers remaining if I traveled along the shoreline on the west side of the lake to avoid the deep water in the center and round out my circuit. The wind was calm. The water was smooth. The entire lake seemed wrapped in peace. And I heard a loon calling out in the distance. So I sat down, saved my work, and listened for a while. I saved my map layers, my customized symbols and swatches, my map themes, my label settings, my scale bar settings, and my graticule settings, which ultimately will save time in the future. As the sun began to set, I paddled on to arrive at the dock just before sunset. The next day, I export the map layers to a KML format to save the data collected with Avenza Maps. The KML file can then be imported into the map, where I can open the attribute table and access the data description field, the photos, and the metadata. With this information, I am able to label the new points of interest. I modify a field to label each point with a number that represents the order of my SUP route, and then create a secondary label to include a brief description and the time of day. I then include a postcard title block to briefly summarize my experience and integrate a QR code to make the PDF of my map and photos accessible to others. Lastly, I include a source statement to acknowledge my data providers and influence. Once everything is complete, I export my map to a GeoPDF format to be shared with others or utilized for a future SUP with Avenza Maps. All of this information integrated together provided me with the opportunity to reflect on the entire experience, on the distance that I traveled, how long it took me to travel between each point, to learn more about the character of the areas that were either easier or more difficult to navigate, and utilize this knowledge to plan for the future. My experience in the field prompted me to explore how map design can provide support with greater depth by taking into account the specific information needs of the activity. It has challenged me to take a deeper dive into how I can apply software functionality to support a specific activity. It has also helped me create a blueprint for a map concept that can be delivered on multiple platforms to support a particular activity from a variety of perspectives. Investing the time to create a customized map before heading out into the field leads to a safer, more enjoyable experience. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge those who maintain and make the data sources available, those who create and maintain the software that enables people to perform analysis and create cartographic products, as well as those who create the methodologies to enable people to effectively render the physical and cultural geographies to support decisions. I thank you.